This is Aiden again, coming to you finally with my second video. So, I am so thankful that Spirit was like, listen, they completely affirmed what I said in my first video, where I was like, it's not going to be every week, it's going to be when I feel inspired. And so, that was the message, and it's okay because now I feel inspired. I think the biggest part, when I was thinking about doing this video, the biggest part of me that I was thinking about is going back in my head on where did I learn these expectations coming into my transition, um, and how did I navigate them. Alexa, turn the volume down a little bit. She's got to go, by the way. I don't trust her, but right now she's the only device I have. So I always like to, on my old channel, I pay homage to, there was a trans guy in my life named Taylor, and it was actually through him that I found my own strength to come into my own, and will always be thankful for having been able to be blessed to watch his journey and watch his own affirmations happen, and him to step into his power, because I don't think if it wasn't for him I would have been able to transition in the time that I did. And so my transition begun in 2014. Wow, that's so long ago. And so at first I I privately transitioned, right? Like my transition was to myself, was to have my own personal realization, like, fuck, this is who I am. Like I've battled with this concept of what it means to be a little girl growing up, what it means to be a teenage girl, and what it means to be an adult woman. None of those felt right for me. Like something, it's always felt wrong, um, and not like that it was a negative thing or like I was demonizing, but it didn't feel right for me, and I didn't understand why. So my way of combating that was like trying to navigate through all of these different experiences of my queerness, right? I was like, well, even though, and me not having that language and understanding that, gender and sexuality is different, but because I was so uncomfortable with that identity, I was like, okay, I need to do something. So I began navigating, my queerness, and started out with me identifying as bi, and then that turned out me identifying as a lesbian, and then that turned into me identifying as a no label, free spirit with my best friend. And each one of those felt a little better, but never complete, or never fully like, this is my own. And so I was like, fuck, what is this? What's missing? What am I missing here? After I was able to come into my awareness, and into my own, and being honest with myself of like, now I have the language to say, oh, I'm a trans person. I'm a trans man, and I'm masculine, and that's okay, right? And so these were the three things that felt right for me at the beginning of my transition. Prior to socially transitioning, meaning coming out to folks and verbalizing it and changing my Facebook and changing my name and changing my pronouns, and then medically transitioning. Before all that, I began researching on YouTube like different trans men and their experiences and listening to them. And the more I listened, the more I was like, this feels good. Like, this must be the way. Oh my goodness, I didn't know why I didn't do this before. Why didn't I think to look before? And fortunately and unfortunately, a lot of those narratives, now looking back at it, were different forms of the same perpetual, fragile masculinity and toxic masculinity that cis men uphold on the daily. Even though I was cognizant of like, I am transitioning from being a black woman to being a black man, I have no idea what that looks like. And so I was like searching for outside validation of what that looks like because I've never had a black male figure in my life that I felt was healthy, that wasn't toxic. So I didn't have a framework, a blueprint of how do I craft my masculinity to look like not the ways that masculinity has been perpetuated onto me violently. Yet, as I was looking up these trans men's stories, it was all very the same toxic ideologies of like hyper masculinity, like, oh, we need to look like this, we need to be buff, we need to work out, we can't leave any ounce of femininity left in our transition because of that fear of being misgendered, that fear of being invalidated, that fear of not being man enough, which I challenge y'all, what does that even mean? What is man enough? What does it mean to be a man? Now I can have those critical conversations, but before I couldn't. That was an aspect. Another aspect was a lot of the men that I was looking to was very normative, cis and heteronormative as well. So at that time, there wasn't even room for me to even encompass my queerness and that in the way that I have now. Because I was just like, oh, okay. So when transitioning, I will be technically like a straight man. And so a lot of those narratives was what was playing over and over and over again from the men that I was looking up to in ways to fit my transition into what I thought was what defined being a man, and on top of that, being a black man. And so it was bad. It was bad. I'm gonna make this into parts because I'm gonna talk about each different part, right? So there was that. So there was the hyper masculinity of what our bodies need to look like, how we need to engage with our bodies, what do we do with our bodies, down, and so that means physical activity, that means sexual activity, like down to, which is interesting. There was this hyper push for you need to feel dysphoria to be a true trans man, right? Like you can't associate with your genitalia that you have prior to any medical surgeries that you may want or have had. Like, right? Like to identify with that means that you are not man enough. You are not a trans man. There was this narrative to push that, like, you need to feel dysphoria. You need to be disconnected from, and trigger warning, we're going to talk about genitalia and parts and stuff. So if you're not comfortable hearing with the terminology that I use and that I'm comfortable using now, don't don't watch this video. Or if you're comfortable with your clitoris, if you're comfortable with your labias, if you're comfortable with um, if you're comfortable with your breast, right? Um, then that then that you are not a trans man, and you won't be accepted. And you also have the the toxic masculinity behaviors of you need to be aggressive, you need to be hyperly aggressive. You can't be There can't be any remnants of femininity. You can't be fluid. You can't have any feminine movements. Um, you can't express yourself femininely. That means like clothing, right? Movements, the way you walk, the way you talk. Like, goodness, there was so many different men who would force themselves to have these deeper voices, right? And I'm not, I want to disclaim and say that there's nothing wrong with that. Like, if you're uncomfortable with the tone of your voice, the register of your voice, and that is your way of training yourself to have a deeper voice, that's fine. People who are engaging in it in a toxic way because they themselves were either shamed or bullied for not embrace or not working on having a deeper voice, even down to like picking names. Um, like you feel pressured to have something that is deemed as masculine, where you won't be, you know, accidentally misgendered, which I understand. That shouldn't take away your identity. That shouldn't define you as being lesser than of anything. There's so many constructs. Like gender is a construct. Like the way that we go with our expression of gender is a construct, right? Like it's all we all define it. We're all defining it. Society defines it in a very toxic way, but and the beauty is we get to define it for ourselves. Um, and if someone doesn't agree with that, fuck them, okay? Because they're not in your body. They don't have your soul. There was a lot of toxic patriarchy ideals that were going around, right? Like of trying to conform to these patriarchal roles that didn't allow for people who didn't identify in any of the binaries, whether you identified as a trans man or a trans woman, that didn't allow for folks who didn't identify with either or who identified with both. Um, that didn't allow them to feel embraced, to feel as important, to feel just as affirmed. Um, and it was shitty. It was shitty, and I really am sorry, and I want to hold myself accountable and apologize to all folks out there, all femme folks, all folks who are non-binary, gender non-conforming. I want to apologize to you personally for engaging in that behavior. It's damaging. It's violent. Wait for part two.